welcome. We are here to talk today about recession prepping your IT. It's all the rage in the news today. All the talk of recession gets all the headlines. But I know you're working on a series. Do you want to introduce your series and just kind of talk through what you guys are doing before we step in?
That would involve me being really, really well organized, and we've known each other long enough to know that this is not going to happen. But the bottom line is we're trying to put together a series of talks where we can just be a little more proactive about this, whether it be from a financial standpoint, a productivity standpoint, a security standpoint. And what we wanted to do for this one was talk more from a budget, which IT, especially for the small, medium businesses, is not something we always spend as much attention on as we should. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that we had folks who actually know what they're talking about involved here. And for this, we got Alex Sparling
Well, you
over
give me
at.
high praise, Bob. There's high praise. Folks who
If I
actually
give
know what they're
praise at
talking
all,
about.
it's high because I don't normally give it at
There you
all.
go.
And he even has a slide to tell me.
Yeah.
Alex, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. So I, much like you, I ran an IT services company for a long time, and we started as a little break fix mom and pop shop where grandma would come bring her computer to get it fixed, and we evolved into small business support and then medium business support, and eventually into some K-12 and education and some municipalities and some much bigger technology that we supported. And as we got to working with more and more advanced businesses, we learned that the municipalities, the schools, they had serious budgets and they had to plan ahead, and no longer could we just go surprise them and say, hey, I'd like some money today for all the stuff I should have told you about a year ago. So in that process, I built another company, which is a software company that's kind of built the budgeting engine that we talk through, and we'll reference a little bit today. But it's really the thing that caused me to focus on this part of the business. And it's kind of one of those where when you focus all your time and energy on it, you just get better at certain portions of the business, right? So I've gotten pretty good at extrapolating and building and putting together these technology budgets because it's a thing that I've spent the better part of the last 3 years focusing on as I rounded out my work at my IT company. So with that, we'll get to this good-looking dude who doesn't have a beard.
Okay. Apparently our screens aren't in sync because you got my picture up.
Yeah.
Anyway, again, most of you know me, CEO Simplex-IT, author of 3 books, do a lot of co-managed IT. But one of the things that really I would like to say we're very much focused on is sharing education, not with just clients, with the community, including our competition. I think we've got some other MSPs here on this call as well,
Good.
because rising tide lifts all boats. And this is one of those where, and to kind of piggyback on what Alex was saying, not only is that sort of stuff so required, but it is also so infrequently done properly.
Yeah.
And I'll even take us up to task on that, and that's why we're partnering with Alex's firm to help us help other organizations, including ourselves, do a better job on this. But to be very, very clear, this is not a sales pitch here. We're really just going to talk about budgeting 101 from an
Yeah.
IT standpoint.
So. But I mean, in defense of IT companies, because I was one, and I feel a lot of empathy for their challenges today. IT's hard, right? These guys have to be right 100% of the time. They've really got to focus on tools and automation and all these things. And I built this new business because there wasn't a tool in the space to do this. So it's easy for us all to step back and say we haven't been good about doing this in the past. In fairness, small businesses have QuickBooks. IT companies didn't have very much as far as tools. It was a pen and a pad to come out and plan some of this, right? The best tool we had was an Excel spreadsheet. So it was hard. We're trying to make it easier. And that kind of leads us into the conversation of where did we come from? And where we come from is something I like to call the cycle of popularity. And if you look at this budget, it's a 5-year IT budget for a customer. In 2022, 2023, and 2024, as the IT guy, I was probably pretty popular. My spend was pretty low. It was pretty regular. It was pretty desirable by the customers. They didn't have to. There were no surprises. In 2025, I was probably very unpopular when I went to them and said, "Oh, I should have been having you replace stuff all along, and this year I need an extra $40,000." Right. And so we became really unpopular. And if you're an IT guy in here, you might recognize this trend. It looks like everything's purring along, and Windows XP died, and now all my customers have to spend a bunch of money, right? This operating system goes end of life. And then everything's good for 5 years because we just bought everything brand new.
And the other situation that can also happen is when the owner or management comes to the IT person and says, I want to be able to do this. And you have to say, well, none of our hardware can support it, none of our software can support it.
Yeah.
Surprise there.
Yep. Yep. Because we haven't been talking about this all along.
Right.
So, this is one of those things where once you replace everything in this budget, it's going to be 2025. Guess what? Everything's going to be brand new, and you're not going to need to replace anything in 26 or 27 or 28. And then come 2029, your customer's going to be mad at you again, right? 2029, 2030, when that thing shoots through the roof. So it's very cyclical. If a 5-year chunk doesn't really show it, but it's very cyclical. And I actually had a customer who told me if I came to him and knocked on the door with a $20,000 surprise again, he would take me outside and shoot me. And this was in very rural southern Delaware, and the guy had a jacked up pickup truck with a shotgun rack in the back window. So I was a little intimidated, and this is when I decided I had to start doing budgets. So I got out my Excel spreadsheets and I started doing budgets. And back then it was just super simple. It was, hey, you've got 20 PCs in a server, so we're going to replace 5 PCs a year, and in year 6 or in year 5 we're going to replace the server, and then we're going to start over again, right? And that was the first budget. And that was kind of how we started with it. But now we've really tried to dive into this and talk about how to do this differently and what we can do better or different. It wouldn't be an Alex webinar without at least one corny joke. So I like to tell the old knock knock joke, and it's literally knock knock and management. Who's there? IT. IT who? IT who needs a pile of cash for you to replace hardware that I should have warned you about a long time ago, but never got around to. And management's response typically unfavorable. So, you talk a lot about that management often doesn't understand or appreciate the value that IT brings into the business, but rather almost sees IT as a necessary evil. There's some improvement to be had on both sides here, because as
Absolutely.
IT guys, we haven't come to the table. As business leaders, it wasn't demanded that we come to the table. And I promise you, other components of the business had budgets, right? Other departments in the business had their department budgets, and IT's always treated as an afterthought. It's all too often not really looked at as the thing that can lead the growth of the business or that can lead change in the organization. It's all too often just, how much money do I have to pay to Bob? How much money do I have to pay to Alex to get him to stop complaining so I can go on about the rest of my business?
Right. And when you think about it, in most cases for organizations, whatever their end goal product and services are, they aren't necessarily directly tied to the technology spend. The technology spend lets us do that more effectively or more efficiently, but it's not close enough to the end product or service for management to immediately say that's why we have to pay that money so that we can make the widgets.
Yeah. And so we get left in that scary, like, or in the very terrible, where IT is going, well, if you don't do this, somebody's going to get breached, and that isn't a good healthy conversation either, right? It
Right.
becomes almost sales by scare tactic from IT, which is totally the wrong way to go about this. So,
Right.
we'll talk later about a little bit of budgeting. First, speaking of scare tactics, let's talk about what's in the news, which is pretty abysmal these days. If you Google the economy, just about anything about the economy, you're going to hear about recession. You're going to hear about chip shortages. You're going to hear about supply shortages. Um, all of this is conversations because clickbait. Right. At the end of the day, they want you to click on something. They have to have a sensational highlight. The cool thing about economists is I'm pretty sure the only reason they were brought into existence was to make weather people look accurate. There's always the old joke that the Economist has predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions, and this may be no different. Um, I'm here to say I'm not an economist. Bob's not an economist. Neither of us are experts on this topic, but I firmly believe that whatever the economic outlook for 2023 and 2024 is, it doesn't really matter. If we do the right things right in good times, we'll be set up to succeed in bad times. If we haven't accumulated a lot of technology debt, if we've been upfront with forecasting and budgeting, if we're doing all the right things, then even if we have a terrible year and we have to scale back our IT spend for a year, guess what? We were caught up. So there's a lot to be said for just putting together a plan so that we plan for the worst and hope for the best, and just continue to execute the plan throughout. I think this speaks very much to the importance of having strategy, because every I don't know, 10 years or so. We kind of seem to go through this cycle. And I was in my MSP in 2008. It almost put us out of business. It was a terrible time. We weren't helping our customers enough being strategic. And it was really one of the lessons that we learned from that. And when 2020 came around, we were a much more strategic organization and able to help our customers through that, economic turmoil and uncertainty of COVID way better than we were a decade before.
And I think that brings up a good point. Whether you are an MSP dealing with clients or you are internal IT dealing with your management, the ability for you to be strategic in your conversations is critical for you to provide value and for IT to provide value to the company. Because you've got, if you think about it from the standpoint, you've got management looking at all this clickbait stuff, and a lot of them will do knee-jerk reactions. And one of the best ways to do knee-jerk reactions is to do it against something that you don't understand. And IT is one of the biggest things for that. So we'll just cut IT's budget in half. What could be the harm there? But for you to think strategically in terms of not only how, I don't want to say ignore the clickbait, but have a strategy and a plan in place, increases your value for a good organization to recognize what you're bringing to the table. Again, whether you're internal IT or a managed service provider.
And at the end of the day, a lot of these managed service providers, as they grow, they find that as they mature, they just naturally attract more mature customers. And I think it speaks to that, right? As we get better at our job, as we get better at speaking strategically, more mature and strategic customers want to be
Yep.
attracted to us, want to work with us. So it's a win-win, really, both for the customer and for the MSP. But as we kind of step into it, really what we're talking about here is building a plan. And this is maybe the world's simplest plan. It's 3 whole steps, right? And it's really about assess the status quo. Where do we start? Where are we at in 2022, September 2022? What is out there for technology debt? What's out there for future technology spend? What do we need to spend before the end of the year? What do we need to spend in 23 and 24 and 25? And where are we on that plan, right? So assess the status quo. What do we own? What are the things we're going to have to start replacing? You could call this inventory. It's really just stepping back and taking an inventory. But I think it's deeper than an inventory of just your physical assets of your
Right.
workstations and servers, and we'll get into that in a minute. Um, and then simply build a budget. I'm a big fan of a couple of different budgets, and we'll talk about that. It's easy to think a budget is a budget is a budget, but we'll talk about the difference between a tactical and a strategic budget. I think that there is a real importance in having a near-term and actionable budget, as well as kind of a long-term wide-angle guess budget to flag things like that big spike that we saw a couple slides back, right? If we go back to this slide right here, I want to know about this year early and often. I want to talk about, I want to know about it early and I want to talk about it often so that when it gets here, it's not a surprise to leadership or to anybody who's involved in the process. So we'll kind of talk about that as we go. And then it's all about implementation, right? Just doing the thing that the budget tells us we ought to be doing. Because the budget is kind of a no nonsense factual document. It doesn't have opinions or feelings. It just says, hey, things are getting old. It's time to replace them. So it really boils down to just making a plan that works and then executing the plan.
And you can also take this concept, even if you're starting at nothing. You can actually start with just these very simple steps. What is your status quo? Create the old Excel spreadsheet that simply says, here's a list of all the stuff. Here's how old it is. Here's how long we think it can last. Here's the
Yeah.
replacement cost. You just do that.
It's really that easy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to that end, you mentioned how long does it last? Every asset has an end of life date, right? Just scribble
Yep.
that date down, and when that date hits, put some money on the budget to replace it.
Yeah. And one of the things you can
That's
do,
how hard this is.
if you're talking to management, one of the questions you can ask is, how old should the oldest PC be? How old should the oldest equipment be? And let them answer the question.
Yeah.
And it may be an answer that survives. It may be an answer that is unrealistic. But it's a starting point.
Yep. And whatever that number is they tell you, bring them a PC that's that old and ask them to work on it. And
Yep.
if they can do their job on it, then life is good. And if they can't,
Yep.
well, expectations will get adjusted. But there's something to be said about setting those expectations across the organization and really figuring out how to live with them. So let's get into what is an IT budget, and I'm going to throw something in the chat here if I can figure out how to do that on Teams, because I am admittedly not a Teams
There's a
guy.
button called chat.
Yeah, I see that. I'm hoping that that goes out to everyone and not just to you and me, but we'll see. So
No, it should be everywhere.
we have kind of a little flyer that we post out that is a uh just a quick little one sheeter, talks about all the things that ought to be on an IT budget and kind of give you an idea of what's in there to be complete. It's easy to forget things like the internet connected toaster. I always kind of joke about that, but there's all kinds of weird stuff in your building that's connected to the internet, and it's all indirectly technology, and some of it's really expensive. Over my years of helping companies figure out what technology budgets ought to include, we had some really big surprises, right? We always knew workstations and servers and copiers and those kind of things, they need to be included. They're kind of, there's a no-brainer there. We get down into the things that are harder to identify, the switch that's underneath of the front desk where the receptionist sits that feeds the printer up there, right? And we'll eventually find those and we'll get them on there too. But things like security awareness training and what you pay to the shredder guy and the e-waste guy to destroy hard drives when they come and pick those things up. Well, every time you replace a PC, there's a cost for getting rid of that old one. And it's easy to think about what it costs to replace the new one, to buy the new one, but sometimes we forget that extra 50 or $100 that it takes to destroy the contents of the old one. Maybe there's some labor involved in swapping out that equipment. So always consider those extra little things and put them in there. Bob, you might have some ideas of things that I left off this list, but sit down and really try and make an exhaustive list. And that last line, I think, is the one that gets interesting, right? Door access control. If you have to replace the guts of a door access control system because it got so old that it's not supportable anymore, it can be 20 or $30,000 for a building. I've seen HVAC systems go in the six figures for large buildings for some of the schools that we used to work in. And when they would say the HVAC can't hook up to, it needs Windows XP and we can't adjust it all electronically anymore, they'd have to go in and make some pretty major adjustments. And same things with some of these other IoT devices, the camera systems, all these other things that hook up to the buildings. Some of these can be really big expenses. And
Yeah,
I always found that when I went to a customer who was facing an issue with one of those things, all my other things, maybe the server and the switches and the firewall that I thought should be priority, just lost all importance because they had to address this one big mission critical thing to run in the building.
and the couple of points I want to double down on here is one is this is a process. This is not a document.
Yeah.
And so you can basically, once you've got that first pass of a budget or first pass of a process done, you're always going to be evaluating it and take a look at, oh, okay, we're going to budget this much more per device for replacement costs because, like you were saying, disposal or the like. And there's also the cost of what happens if it breaks. Now, this is kind of a little bit outside of the of this topic conversation, but it's also important conversation to have with management. So, in other words, if you've got, and this is especially true for our manufacturing friends out there, because manufacturing, historically, the definition for obsolescence is manufacturing is it didn't turn on.
Right.
And if you have a device that is generating, $30,000 of revenue every day, but it has to be run on an XP machine,
Yeah.
you
And
know,
one day it just doesn't turn on. Yeah.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
a bad day if you haven't planned ahead of time. So you look for those opportunities to continue to improve the document, to not only to hone to make the dollars and the numbers in there more accurate, but also to add more of the services and more of the devices and more of the risks that you have so that you can actually have a good conversation with management, again, as an MSP or as internal IT,
Mhm.
about here are the costs, here are some of the risks, here's the cost to mitigate, or the cost if the risk manifests itself.
And I love the conversation about it being a living, breathing document. And this goes back to a conversation I had with one of my partners. It's also a little bit of a challenge sometimes to your relationship, right? If you're the IT provider and you have to go to your customer for the first time and say, hey, open up the books and tell me what you spend for your internet circuit and your phone circuit and for the copier guy and for all these other things, it feels a little intrusive. So there's a conversation to be had with your customer here about why this process is important,
Right.
why there's a little bit of kind of open up and show me all the things. Because traditionally, if you had gone to a customer and said, what's your budget for technology? Their answer usually starts with something like, how little can I get away with? Um, And that's way different from, well, let's sit down and build a budget and actually pile up the numbers and show you how much you probably spend on technology that you're not thinking about today. But the only way we can really be proactive is to sit down and pile that all into one document and get good data that we can look at. So, we actually have a partner who now, as part of his sales process, helps his client build a budget before he ever seals them as a client. And he sits down and helps them build a budget. And the clients who push back and say, I really don't want to give you that level of visibility, he pushes back on him just a little bit and says, look, as if you're going to come to work with me, this is going to be expected. We're not going to nickel and dime back and forth for every dollar. We're going to have an idea what a realistic budget is, because you and I have to agree on it. You and I have to spend the same amount of money. We have to have access to the same amount of money to run the business. And I can't be expecting a level up here and you expecting a level down here. It will just lead to problems in the future. He said, since he started it, the level of maturity of the clients that are coming to him is just through the roof. And he's super excited about it. And his clients are getting a better experience. Even the ones who ultimately say, you're probably not the guy I want to work with, they walk away with a budget. They walk away having started something. And he's charging them for it. And it's a project when he gets started with them. But it's really valuable to both of them. But he's really doubling down on that. I can't really fix your problems if I don't have insight into what kind of a solution you can afford.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add, again, from the internal IT person's perspective, even though you'll notice the parallels are definitely there between both the external consultant, MSP, whatever you want to call it, and the internal person, is anecdotes. Any kind of story that reinforces how this type of planning helps facilitate moving forward. And especially if you have experience, so you know that there was a failure of some kind a couple of years ago that caused, it doesn't even need to be necessarily IT.
Yep.
But we weren't prepared for this loss. You remember when the guy in accounting who did all of the books left suddenly? We weren't prepared. I want to prevent that from happening because of a piece of equipment failing or the like.
Right. Yep. And this goes right back to that same parallel. Your in-house IT needs to know what the budget they're dealing with is as well, right? You can't
Absolutely.
operate as the IT guy who lives in the server closet. Nobody talks to him unless he's out here begging for money. IT guys are not the pauper with the cup and the sunglasses, begging for a nickel to solve a problem every day.
Especially if you want to seat at the table.
Yeah.
If you want to be considered to be part of the critical management team that's moving your company forward, which is very, very nice position to be when it's time for reviews, raises, and that kind of fun stuff.
Reorganizations.
You got it.
Yeah.
Or looking for a job at another company that values IT better.
Yep. Yep.
So this
So
helps
th-
you.
so there is a little bit of an open book paradigm here, and you've really got to figure out how to get management on board to be able to do that. Because once we open the book and start taking a look at things, we get into the ability to have true visibility into technology debt. And in this example, we have a customer who, their technology spend isn't crazy for the next couple of months, right? This is a 6-month budget, but they're sitting on almost $55,000 in expenses that should have been spent by now. They should have replaced a server, a bunch of workstations, some network equipment, some line of business software, a router, right? There are some things here that this company should have replaced. And at this point, this customer is in a situation where any one or any number of those pieces of equipment could become obsolete, could stop turning on, could cause them problems, and they're going to have to spend all that money at once, right? If something in a worst case scenario, some new piece of software comes along and now it won't run on those old workstations, they now have to replace $30,000 in workstations overnight without a plan. So, the concept of technology debt is a really big and important thing. As we're headed into a recession, I think we double down on looking at that number. Do we want to go into bad times being caught up, or do we want to go into potentially bad times in a scenario where we should have spent a bunch of money that we didn't? And if things go sideways, revenue comes down, the business gets harmed in some way. We're in a position where now not only are we struggling to make our day-to-day technology payments, but we've got this big, overwhelming number kind of hanging over our heads that we've got to deal with. So that gets a little bit into my favorite way to talk about budget forecast, and that's really splitting the budget forecast up two ways. I really think that we should have that, and we're just looking at a 6-month budget forecast with literally a number in every single month. in that period, we're looking at when does Bob in accounting get a new PC? When does Alex in sales get a new laptop? We're down to the when does the squeaky wheel gets the grease? And in a less mature organization, that's going to be a real conversation on the regular. Somebody's complaining to me, they get a new PC. Okay, we'll give them a new PC and let them go away. In a more mature organization where we've really built budgeting as one of the kind of the legs that holds up the IT stool, that conversation just goes away. Bob, you always get a new PC every 4 years, and you're 3 years in, so you'll get one in a year. Wait your turn, right? And we know exactly when this money gets spent. But also near term actionable, we know from month to month what our spend looks like. So when we're sitting here and having a conversation, we know $7,300 in September, but $12,000 in October, and then our spend returns back down to kind of a normalized spend down here. So we've got some sort of a quarterly or an annual or semi-annual contract that gets paid in that time period. And these are important because there are products out there, HubSpot, for example. If you have prepay for a year, you're going to spend $40,000 on HubSpot, but you're going to save 20%. And so that's a pretty big number. And when that aligns with something else that's going on in the business, like big hardware replacements get shoved one direction or another because that HubSpot payment's pretty static. You can't really move it. So that near-term actionable budget becomes important to just managing immediate cash flow, right? That long-term strategic budget, I use the Jim Collins phrase, the wide angle guess, right? The further out we get, the less accurate that budget might be. But we do want to be able to, back to that first diagram that we had, we want to be able to spot that big year where we spend double. And we want to be able to talk about it early and often, maybe address it strategically ahead of time, buy down some of that spend early, commit to leasing or some sort of a payment service that we can turn this into an opex expense instead of a capex expense or something like that. So I really think we should be looking at our budgets both in a really long-term capacity and yet a near-term, more detailed capacity. I think there's a lot of value in doing that both ways. You want to add anything there, Bob?
Yeah, like I don't. So the point I would make is actually, if you roll back everything that's been said up till now, it may sound on the complicated side, especially if you're an IT person who doesn't work a lot with the financial, with the numbers part. But it really comes down to what we said at the beginning: get a good inventory on the goods and services you have. What's the appropriate lifespan of it? What are the costs during that lifespan? And what are the replacement costs? And constantly updating that.
Yep. And that's just
Everything.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to
uh,
say that feeds us into the two budget examples that we see here. So here you have near term
well,
and actionable. When does a human get a PC? And then that long term budget forecast.
humans.
So the beauty of this is we have two different conversations here, and one is how do we survive and get through 2025. The other is how do we go into a questionable year like 2023 without being way behind, and that comes into just making sure that we're spending what we need to spend along the way to stay
Right.
caught up.
And so instead of having a knee-jerk reaction with, oh, we have to buy all these computers because people said we do. Well, are they all that old? Are they all that obsolete? Are they all out of date? Do we need them as far as personnel replacements or anything along those lines? And the same thing is true from a server standpoint, from a services standpoint. My suspicion is you may be organizations are paying for IT they didn't even know they had, subscriptions they didn't realize they were paying for and haven't used the service in years.
Well, one of the best things I heard from an MSP that we've just started working with was that when they sit down with a client and draw out a budget, they bubble all these kind of things to the top. They see that the client's paying for Monday.com or some sort of planner type software, and then they sit
Right.
down with the customer and explain to them that Microsoft 365 has a feature like this built in. Oh, and by the way, when I make a to-do in the Microsoft version of it, it syncs to your Outlook calendar and to your Microsoft to-do list, and it's all built into into that
Right.
bigger ecosystem, and everything plays nicer together. And they've been able to sit down with multiple customers and just cancel some of these old subscriptions, right?
Yep. Yep.
Get them some visibility into where data might have been leaking out of the building and how some of this becomes just easier to get the customer to agree to maybe further explore the solutions you guys already have, because you guys have a ton of solutions, sometimes that our customers are just barely scratching the surface on.
Yep.
And then the last thing that kind of plays into this, um, don't remember where I was going with that. You said something that made me think, and I
Ooh,
didn't think,
sorry
and
about that.
yeah, it hurt
I
a
hate
little
it when
bit.
that happens.
It couldn't have been too important because it escaped me
Yeah,
pretty quickly, but
yeah.
um, that's going to bother me now. I'm going to have to remember what you said. So when we get through this, at the end of the day, I used to have a sign in my office that said, "What is winning? How do we know we're winning?" Was what the sign said, and I would always talk to my engineers about this because engineers are, they're very to-do focused. We can close a trouble ticket, boom, on to the next thing. Close a trouble ticket, boom, on to the next thing. Install a PC, on to the next thing. Sometimes when we get into some of these things, it's bigger than just check a box and show that we did the work. And this is to your earlier point, this becomes a living, breathing document that just gets discussed in regular strategic planning sessions with with your internal organization, with your outside consultants. This becomes something that really is important to kind of share some of that data back and forth. So there's some things you need to consider. Bob already mentioned the lifespan of an asset, right? How long is any individual asset for? And you need to sit down and take the time to write this stuff out, decide how long we keep an asset, build our inventory of assets, and start to run it through the replacement cycle. That's where the initial budget comes from. We need to talk about replacement costs. Are those costs as cut and dry as what we pay to CDW when we go buy a laptop on the internet, or what we pay to Simplex-IT when they come out and deliver a laptop? Or are there some additional hidden costs? Is there downtime we need to plan for any given replacement of an asset? If you replace an asset that's big enough, a server, a big piece of network equipment, you can take the whole organization down for a half a day. And we need to think about those kind of things and how they might affect our budget, how they might affect when we're able to do some of this kind of stuff. We should be thinking about the change in price as we look out into the future. If you had told me 2 years ago that the average PC going out the door today would be $1,500 or $1,800, I would have told you were crazy. If you told me that today, I'd say, yeah, that sounds about right. I'm not surprised by those numbers. So, these things change pretty quickly sometimes. We need to reevaluate our budget and adjust it from time to time just for the real world that we live in. So knowing that inflation and just shortages, supply shortages and those kind of things are going to have an impact, which takes me to exactly what I forgot to say earlier, which is that supply shortages are the other thing that are going to play into this. And if you're still looking at chip shortages, if you're still looking at availability shortages, it just means we should be planning a little further out, buying equipment a little earlier, being okay with replacing it a couple of months early if it actually shows up on time, but expecting that it might not.
But the thing is that with a system or process like this in place, that becomes a tactical action.
Yep.
It
And it's
becomes an
something.
action. You don't have to, oh my God, we got to reinvent the wheel. We have to redo everything. We're doomed, all that. Instead, what's going to happen is, okay, our actionable time is going to be, it's going to be 2 months instead of 1 month before we need it. Or the replacement cost is going to be, X number of dollars instead of Y number of dollars.
Yep.
And it's at the end of the day, it's still, the process is still going to be right there telling you, okay, well, now you need to spend this much money or plan
Instead
on
of
this
needing
much time.
a crystal ball to figure out what to do next, we're literally just looking one column to the right on the spreadsheet.
Yep.
Right? It really becomes a much more manageable task. And the other thing we should think about is, how is business going to change over the life cycle of an asset? Right? And Bob, I'm going to ask you this one because you're still pretty active in the MSP space. I sold my MSP 2 years ago, so my answer is flawed. But how many of the servers that you bought this year will be replaced versus migrated to the cloud or turned into a software as a service application, some sort of a web hosted application? Are we to a point where those things are just disappearing?
So the flaw in your question is that you're talking about this year. Because if you're asking about this year, you're asking me to basically say 3 or 4 years into the future. And in most cases, if we're buying servers today, we're buying servers because there's an on-premise
So
reason
you've
for
already
this
moved a lot of
organization.
these things to the cloud.
Exactly. It's one of those where when you get, but this is actually a good point. When you see that spike of here's where our capex expense is gonna go up significantly because we're gonna have these servers. The year before then, might be the time to say, okay, should we reevaluate for a significant change?
So
So
when we
again,
see
yeah, this
this,
example right here.
right, when we see this down here, we start looking at it and saying, do we need to
Right,
make a change from a capex expense to an opex expense?
right.
And that might be leasing, it might be hardware as a service, renting, whatever you want to call it, or it might be subscribing to a cloud product or service
Right.
that lets you do the job without having to make that big upfront spend. And early on in my business days, I used to say, when I would talk to customers about leasing, I would literally tell them, I'm cheap, I hate to pay interest, so I don't lease anything. But if you wanted to lease something, I wouldn't blame you. Totally get it why you might want to spend $400 a month instead of $80,000 all at once, right? The more mature I got in my business, the more I started to look at that different and say, if I could take this delta, right, that extra $40,000 that lives in there and go plow it into a salesman or into a some business investment that would make me money over time, it could probably outpace a measly $400 or $500 a month that I might have to spend on a subscription service, and that might be a good investment. So different of your customers are going to respond to that differently. Different of your business units are going to respond to that differently. Depending on where your business is at, you may respond to that answer differently, but you should
And
think about it.
and I think absolutely, but the problem is that so many of us, and again, to use this chart as an example, we wait until 2025 to have that conversation. It's time to replace the server unless you don't want to. In which case then it is forced, and the timing of the conversation is driving the discussion as opposed to the pluses and minuses.
And we might
Uh,
be buying things in here that kind of depend on that server.
yeah,
We might be buying the wrong things up to this point if we hadn't been thinking about that. So yeah, that long term, that big wide angle guess budget, it's your canary in the coal mine to tell you that problems are happening, but it should really enable some strategic conversations
yep.
really early down the road. I like that, Bob. That's a fantastic point. Um,
It's
Yes, Bob's winning. So back to this, we really want to make sure that we're, if I had one thing to say with how we need to wrap up 2022 for our businesses, it would be address all of that technology debt that's living in our organizations today. And if you're not doing but budgeting today by accident, even if you think you're catching up or staying caught up by accident, you're going to have some technology debt laying around. It's not the end of the world. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not a real problem unless you let it pile up so much that you can't address it. So I would also say this is a good time to look at those cloud migrations, how to get into SaaS applications, how to get into the cloud, how to get your data out there where it's accessible from anywhere. And then this is also a good time when you're building budgets, when you're doing these kind of things, to address the renewals of all of those contracts. As if anybody here has ever felt the pain of an auto renewing contract with a vendor that you didn't care for, it's good for at least a few four-letter words. And if we're looking at each of these things as it feeds into the budget, it's a great opportunity to pick it apart and say, hey, this is a contract that I know ends in 2 years. Maybe it's just your cable contract where it ends and your promo goes away and your price goes up 20 or 30%. Or maybe it's a long-term contract with a vendor that you'll want to reevaluate and try and get rid of at some point. But make sure that you take the time to schedule yourself some reminders somewhere on those contract end dates because they sneak up on you way faster than you realize. They're here and gone, and you're through the little window where you had the chance to send the email and say, actually, I didn't want to renew that. And then you're fighting a backwards battle with a vendor who's got you locked into an auto renewing contract. So budget's a great point in time to start to put some of that together. And then as we build this, the real trick to it is just treating this like any other process in the business, and that is to stick to it. It's really, really easy for us to do this once and go, woohoo, exercise complete, and run away from it. This is something that needs to be reviewed and updated fairly regularly. I would say maybe quarterly in a lot of organizations is okay. Or as you make large changes, right? If you're a small organization and you just buy 2 or 3 computers a year and you do it all at once and you make all your changes, then do it once you've made those purchases. Go back and review the budget, update it, make sure that you've refreshed it for the new purchases now that are going to fall onto the back end of it, and build that process that will forever be something that helps you run your business. Because to Bob's earlier point, this is an iterative process. I said lather, rinse, repeat, but it's literally get the process in place, and just continue to improve it every time you touch it.
And you'll notice all of the tweaks that can be done to this process based on the size, the complexity, the maturity of your organization, of management, of whatever. And there's three issues here that Alex has hit on that I want to double down on here. Is one is eliminate the technical debt. Eliminate the technical debt, the stuff, and there's actually, and I put a link in the chat, I don't think it came out looking right, a link to our learning center, which has videos, including one on what technical debt is. It's basically IT stuff that needs to be upgraded at some point. There's a little more to
Yeah.
it than that, but that's one. The second is shadow IT. What are the things that your organization, what are the IT resources, services, whatever, that you're paying for, but management really doesn't have under control? And so it may be appropriate, may not, may be secure, may not. We've also got a video on that. And then the third that Alex was talking about was you may not need that because you've already got something. And I'm not quite sure what the term for that would be, but that would be where there are resources you are paying for services, or the company is paying for services that they actually are getting in another form through, again, 365 being the poster child for that.
Yep.
This process, when you've identified where the costs are going to, gives you a line item. Do we still need that? Do we still need that? Do we still need that? So it also allows you to prune unnecessary waste uh, from the costs.
And
You know,
it's not just about cost waste. Sometimes it's about efficiency,
yeah,
right? The MSPs who really have dug into Microsoft 365 and figured it out, and this is the same for internal IT departments. If they figured out how all those individual products tie together and all the things you can do with them, there is a real efficiency gain in having everything tied into those products. You go all the way down to, for those of you who don't know, Microsoft has a product called MileIQ. You put it on your cell phone, you drive around in your car all week, and then you go back and look at it at the end of the week and go, oh, here's the 3 trips that were billable mileage back to the business. Check, 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 done. And your expense report is halfway done, right? All your mileage in your personal vehicle is done. There are so many of those little things dialed into there. We use Calendly to schedule calendar links. Well, bookings exists in 365. Folks are using Dropbox and Google Drive, and there's SharePoint and Teams file shares and all those other things
yep,
in 365. Like, your MSP can help you be so productive. Your IT department can help you be so productive with 365 if we just really delve into the tools and say, it's okay to take a step away from the tools that we're used to. We can save a little bit of money, and we can get into a real productivity ecosystem instead of just layering on product after product after product. And
yep,
it'll actually boil down to IT helping you make more money, not just save a few bucks.
yep.
There's my soapbox moment on that.
Well, but it's a great moment, especially when we're trying to talk to organizations where the management is looking at the clickbait, looking at the recession fears, and essentially saying, "You guys don't help me make and sell widgets, so I'm cutting your costs."
Yeah.
These are arguments, conversations that you can have with them that essentially says, well, actually, we can do more together. We can do better. And let's work together to make this happen. And one of the biggest challenges, obviously been the MSP, but I've also been the CIO. I've been the IT consultant. I've been the IT director. I've been whatever. And there's so often a disconnect with management. And if you try to solve that disconnect through situational conversations, then every situational conversation you have is going to be judged by that situation. They're going to just respond to it as they want to respond to that moment. But if you put together this kind of process and you put it in as close to language they understand as possible, money,
Yeah.
budgets, then you are showing that you understand what your organization needs, what your organization defines as success, and want to be part of that success, not just collect a paycheck.
Well, and the other piece of language they understand that I would try and focus on is how they ring their cash register, right? Every business makes money in a different way. If you can
Okay,
tie
give me
technology back to their
give me an
language.
example. Give me a couple examples on that.
Well, yeah, we had a client at my MSP that they were a manufacturing shop, and they were like low tech manufacturing. They made the metal strapping that goes around pallets. So if you've ever bought a pallet with something heavy attached to it, they made that metal strapping and the little brackets that hold it all down. They used their computers for not a lot of things. All of their equipment ran without computers. Their equipment, their computers got used for mailing labels, for punching in and punching out on a time clock, and for writing checks with QuickBooks, right? Three really, really basic functions. So when we went out to talk to them about the same kind of conversations that we have with a lot of our other customers, it just didn't resonate, right? So when we
Yep.
really got these folks nailed down was, well, if we could automate some of the process between taking in a new customer, printing that and getting the data into the mailing label system and printing it out, we could actually save you time there. And they went, oh, you mean one of my grubby guys who's been out in the machine shop all day doesn't have to come in the nice clean office and start typing stuff in on a keyboard in the part of the building we care about keeping clean? And I went, no, we can automate all that. All of a sudden, there's a value conversation, right? Because we're talking their language. I can keep Tim out there working on the machinery, and we can automate the process of the guy on the website who orders metal strapping, pulling the data off the website, sticking it into the mailing label system, and printing out that I forget what they call it, bill of lading or something like that,
Yeah,
and getting all that stuff out into the shop. And before they knew it, they just had a printer out in the shop, and job orders would show up on a printer in the shop. And it made it a whole lot easier for them, and it just really streamlined things for them. So, and it was really fairly basic stuff, capturing data in a web form, a couple of webhooks, and the data was in the database where it belonged. So even our not so technical IT guys, I mean, we weren't developers by any stretch, were able to capture that and do something with it.
So one of the things that I did when I was CIO of a manufacturing company and the like, and I had a staff of about 7, and the traditional, we were all arrogant, we knew better than anybody else, all that kind of fun stuff. But one of the things that we implemented that really, really worked well was during the first 30 days of any new employee, we made them work half a day at about 3 or 4 different spots of the company. And the rule was you cannot give advice of any kind, except maybe to teach them how to, type something or run something. But you can't tell them how to do their job better. You can't do anything along those lines. You just have to soak it in. So you get a view, like you say, how they ring their cash register,
Yep.
what it is that every one of those groups or those departments were doing, and it helped a huge amount for them to get a better understanding, and for the other folks to get a better understanding of the IT folks.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to live in their world. We need to be able to address things the way that they do it. We need to be able to speak their language. So with that kind of wraps up what we wanted to talk about today. We'll just kind of talk through what's coming. Bob and I are going to an event in October.
Wait, what?
And we're going to an event in October, and you're gonna get to see Bob's face looking just like it does in that picture. So if you guys have any interest, feel free to support. We're supporting 5 really great charities. There's information over on cybermatlee.com, but these are Women Who Code, Hackers for Vets, some organizations who really help with technology and helping get the right folks interested in technology. We got 18, I think it is. Do we have 18 folks up there? 19 folks involved, all of whom are cybersecurity gurus, cybersecurity nerds. Every one of them is going to donate their beard to charity when we raise $100,000. We're about halfway there. So if you'd like to spend a few bucks and donate, we'd love to have you. You can donate at cybermatlee.com/shave-that-beard.
This beard shaving, we actually just got someone from one of our industry magazines, Channel Pro, just reached out to me to want to do a story on this and all that. It is going to be. These are all good guys. And,
great human beings. Some of my favorite people.
Yep. Plus me. Plus
even Bob, who picks on me about my beard and my Star Wars.
Well, Alex, to my surprise, this was great and a lot of fun.
I'm glad I could live up to your low expectations, Bob.
I know, really. I thought I was the only one who could be so low to the. Anyway, no.
It's
seriously,
been fun.
It was good.
It's been fun. I look forward to seeing you in Orlando so we can shave some beards.
Sounds good.
All right, buddy. Have a good one. Bye bye.
You too. And thanks to everybody else.